Seahawks season in review here, sort of keep it shorter. We're going to do a separate sort of thing where we're able to go over the full season more in depth and try to get some of our other CSS contributors on that. But we're going to start with the there's some team news to go over here first before we actually get into that, with the exit interviews and such, and the sort of future signings and all that. So we're going to go over that first with Jamal Adams, Jordan Brooks. We'll just see some stuff on that. So Bel, why don't we jump into some injury updates on that?
Yeah, so we do have some injury updates to close out the season here. The first on the list is Jamal Adams. He still has a long recovery that will span into the summer, but is finally starting to move in the sense of using a treadmill and such. Carroll said that Seattle has not been able to use a real plan that they have had for using Adams due to his season-ending injuries. Our next player here that we have an update for is Jordan Brooks. The team is counting on him to be ready for the next season, but Pete Carroll also notes that Brooks is set for surgery on Thursday, and they will not know details about this timeline until after his procedure. And lastly, our update on Will Dissly. He's unclear if he will need knee surgery, so we're waiting to see how his injury is healing there. And we move on to, as Chuck stated already,
She's talking, but I can't hear anything. Oh, like I can't hear her. My aspect. Apologies on that. So we've got all of that. Obviously, that's all. So I'm sorry. What did you go over, Bel?
We went over the injury news.
Yeah, so that's obviously the Seahawks defense has a lot to improve, right? Top to bottom, but hopefully having Adams and Brooks back healthy. I think the keynote there was the real plan quote, right? About getting Adams involved and how they haven't really been able to use him like that, which is really interesting, because you look at his 2020 season where he led the the DB record for sacks in the season. The way that he's been able to, a lot of people consider him like a linebacker, right? And we talked about it last week with the importance that Ryan Neal brings to this team. There's sort of a thing there with how you're going to play those two guys specifically. I'm not worried about how they're going to play Quandre Diggs, but that'll be really interesting. And you're going to need him back, regardless of how people feel about that trade and any of that. You're going to need him back. Jordan Brooks, is a guy that I've given criticism to throughout the season. But still was near the top of the team and the league in tackles. So that'll be important as well to get him back in terms of just kind of rejuvenating that front seven. And again, would like to hear that obviously all those guys are able to have quicker recoveries rather than anything else, and that it's all able to heal then and not have any sort of complications, right? Because, that's a possibility, unfortunately, with that. So that, and then sort of, I think the updates came in exit interviews, but this is stuff that's not related to injuries, thankfully. We'll go over some stuff, including some positive discussions about Geno with the team. Why don't we look at some team notes here?
Yeah, we have some exit interview notes first here. The team has had preliminary discussions with Geno Smith, but are not too deep into anything just yet. They feel assured John Schneider is all over it, Pete Carroll says. On the defense, the inconsistency is something I just can't tolerate. I hate it. We are going to get this fixed. Scheme-wise, we are going to be cleaning things up. Personnel-wise, we are going to be cleaning things up. So sounds like there are several changes that will be made on the defensive end for our Hawks. On the 18th, it was announced that the team extended our kicker, Jason Myers. He has a 4-year, $21 million deal with Seattle, makes Myers the second highest paid kicker in the league by average annual salary behind only Justin Tucker. Myers went 34 for 37 on field goals this season and 41 for 42 on extra points. Myers led the NFL in scoring this season. So great to have him back. On the 22nd, Seattle signs 10 players to futures contracts. Greg Island, Chris Garrett, Jared Hewitt, Joey Hunt, Cade Johnson, Jalen McKenzie, Chris Steele, Darwin Thompson, and Aesop Winston Jr. And that about wraps up our team notes as well as our injury news. So we can go into our brief season in review now.
Starting off, we do the season review, at least here on CSS on Converge. We try to keep it to sort of superlative type, MVP, offensive rookies, newcomer of the year. I always find those to be fun, right? Just because, with a lot of these awards, you say, oh, who's most valuable, which is where we'll start. But I was intrigued by your decision here. I'm not going to say it's wrong just because of, when healthy, what he's able to bring to this team. But I'm intrigued to hear the reasoning here. I think we're going to do you second just because he had a lot of great rookies, right, for this team. But you could tell me if you disagree with it, but I kind of put Kenneth Walker III as our general offensive rookie of the year just as a consensus.
Yeah.
So we'll do you second because that's who you picked for the most valuable player here. And I'm really intrigued by that. So we're going to, just so we can kind of keep that talk in the same sort of realm here, we're going to do that second and go over towards our MVP. I went with Geno Smith. Obviously there have been some murmurs here and there about some of his play throughout the season. But just the way that he had the team and the locker room as a whole, in my opinion, just how he was able to command that locker room, his consistency throughout the season, the sort of performances that he was able to put up. Well, here's an example. Someone had a great point. Let's look at the way that Dallas performed against the 49ers defense. What was it, yesterday? And, I'm not saying that Geno did great against the 49ers defense, but he did better than that. So just to sort of see the way that all played out, to see his season, to go from, again, guy who started off his season well in New York, his career, pardon me, to have that perennial backup label sort of stick with him as he went to other New York, San Diego, and then sticking here for a few years before getting this start. It was really great to see this all take place, and it wouldn't make sense to not have him extended at least for 2 years, right? Just all things considered, the way that he's obviously got this locker room. He's really tied down to this locker room. This locker room really enjoys his presence. He's able to he's not going to be a Patrick Mahomes for you. You don't need that sort of performance, but he's been consistent. He's been efficient. He's had struggles here and there, but this is his first real year as a starter since the Jets days, right? So I just thought, he was kind of part of that story. You look at the Seahawks season, generally sort of looks down upon, we're cast out, doubted, all that. And it kind of resembles his journey, really, to see this sort of thing take place. And for him to, break Russell Wilson's, I believe, I don't know if completions was in there, but I know his passing yards record. Completions might be in there as well. I think you might have that. But that, and then to culminate in a playoff run, it makes it's a world of a difference, I think, to have him involved here to see all that. So I that's where I went with Geno. That's why it made the most sense to me. Again, very intrigued why you went with Ken Walker III here. So why don't we get to that and get some discussion? Again, unless you disagree, had him as offensive rookie of the year as well. So I feel like a lot of this talk of his play really factors in. But why for most valuable? Why did you select him here?
I totally agree with you that he's offensive rookie of the year. But I wanted to go away from just going with the quarterback because, of course, I felt like Geno Smith was a very obvious answer as well. But for me, I don't know how Ken Walker saw his first season going. I don't predict that he saw it going this way as him like being put into the starter position right away. So I think he did really well in taking that position. And for the year, he had 228 carries, 1,050 yards. I'm sorry. That was an average of 4.61 and 9 total touchdowns. So I just think he did really great for his first year. And I don't know if a lot of us predicted that he would come out and, like I said, take that starting position and do so well. So that's why I went with K9. And I'm just looking forward to seeing what he can do as the seasons come.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's really interesting to see the way his season started because I believe his breakout game was against the Saints where he busted off like a 60-yarder. And it was like, oh, wow. And again, like you said, I don't think he envisioned any of this taking place like it did, considering where he sat on the depth chart with Rashad Penny. And again, I believe he's a free agent. So it's not like a necessarily it's not a guarantee that we'll see like a 1-2 punch from those guys next season, considering that maybe Rashad takes his takes, he goes somewhere else. but I can see that, and I certainly get that. And that's the thing that I wish, um, like the MVP award in the NFL would go away from is like quarterback play. Like I get it. Jalen Hurts has been great. Patrick Mahomes is Patrick Mahomes. We're getting to that point where people, I believe, are having Mahomes fatigue, where it's like he's just so good all the time. I'm sick of it. Give me someone else, right? Or even like Steph Curry. Like Steph Curry's great. Yeah, point made. But you'd like to see it because I believe, like dating back to when AP won MVP, it's been all quarterbacks, right? Which again, sure, I get it, but at some point you'd like to see someone else in there. I always kind of cheer for that. So that makes a lot of sense. Offensive Rookie of the Year, again, I don't think we need to really put much discussion into that, considering who it was. We're going to talk about offensive line later here when we go to areas of need, but you can disagree with me when we get down to that. But your offensive tackles and Abe Lucas and Charles Cross, for guys who are rookies, who are starting on the tackles end of ththings, I thought they performed well and helped out Ken Walker, right? But just for him to be the explosive player that he is, and I say explosive, he could be an average back, get the 100-yard games, but you see those big runs he was able to pull off. That's explosion right there. That's all of that sort of thing that goes into getting a big run. So I think, unless you've got anything to add to that, I think it makes a lot of sense for him to be Offensive Rookie of the Year. And it's really exciting to just look at what he can do with this offense, with a full year's the back. I know he was dealing with injuries through preseason and earlier. So to get him a full, healthy offseason will be a big deal for that. Did you have any disagreements with that, or?
No, I think we've been spoiled with our running backs. It's always nice to see the position doing so well. So just like I said, him coming in and just fitting in so well was exciting to see.
Fitting in well is a great point, because obviously there are some players where it's like I have to figure things out first. They don't necessarily gel as well. So that makes a lot of sense. In that regard, we go over here to Defensive Rookie of the Year, and I don't think there was much discussion or discourse about this one as well, with the year that Tariq Woolen had. I would, go with him as the actual Defensive Rookie of the Year in the NFL as well, but it feels like with New York media, Sauce Gardner's might take that over. But with Tariq Woolen being tied for the league lead interceptions and playing the year that he did, it makes the most sense to me. I know we had some other Boye Mafe didn't necessarily he didn't have a year like Woolen did, right? And I'm sure he'll be better as he gets more progression, with this organization through the off season. Kobe Bryant had a solid year. He forced a good amount of fumbles, and he was involved, but nobody stacked up to with the season that Woolen put together. That nobody necessarily would think he would have put together, right? This was one that he was viewed a lot as a project at cornerback, a guy that might need to develop a lot more, and he came through and he was able to produce like he did. Again, the Seahawks signed, I think we talked about this earlier in the season, but Seattle was putting a bunch of veteran corners as healthy and actives because of their two rookies at corner. We saw guys like Artie Burns consistently as a inactive, Justin Coleman, these guys that didn't really play because you saw Woolen and Bryant getting a start, which I think is really interesting for the secondary going forward. So what did you see from Woolen just in an incredible rookie year, really?
I mean, just right off the bat, the comparison to Richard Sherman, it's always hard to do comparisons, but they match so well, and just the comparison fits so well to Richard Sherman. So it was exciting to see that we could kind of get, like, I wouldn't say a shell of what Richard Sherman was, but like a similarity to him. So yeah, it was just the way he fit in so well, so fast.
When you mentioned Richard, it was really interesting when we had the Thursday night game against San Francisco, sort of how excited Richard was to meet him and sort of, speak with him about the year that he's having. Because again, it's hard to replicate certain players, and comparisons are always interesting because no one's going to be like exactly like a certain player. Because I'll tell you one thing, Tariq Woolen's faster than Richard Sherman. Richard was great as a corner, but he wasn't necessarily that fast. But just to see the ball skills that they have, the height and the length and all that, it obviously makes a lot of sense to hear those comparisons in the realm of all that. we go to newcomer of the year, which is that's always fun. Obviously we talk about MVP and offensive and defensive rookies of the year, but newcomer is always interesting just to see who was able to contribute, whether it's free agency or a trade or something like that. I went with Uchenna Nwosu, someone that I was excited for when the offseason came around, and we needed pass rush, and they signed him from San Diego, LA, a guy that went under the radar a lot of the times with the Chargers anyway. He had a decent season last year, and this year he came out and he was able to prove, even in that wild card game against the 49ers, there are several plays where you can look back and see the havoc that Nwosu was able to cause, the disruptions he was able to, take place in along that line there. I like where you went here with Noah Fant. I liked him as part of that trade with the Broncos. He's a young, athletic tight end, and that was something that we talked about at the beginning of the season, right? Was getting those tight ends involved, and I like to see that as the season went on. So I to go back to it before I let you get to Fant, Nwosu, just like what he was able to bring off, not only off the edge, but also obviously the Seahawks defense had trouble stuffing the run. But in recent memory, he had some good plays getting into the backfield against the 49ers in that wild card game. So why did you go with Noah Fant?
I mean, it can't feel good as a player to be part of like a blockbuster trade, because I think that obviously Russell Wilson is going to come out and make their team so much better. So I can only imagine the mentality that you have to go into when you switch teams like that. And I just think that he was utilized very well. And as far as like where he was in the season, he had 4 touchdown catches, but I feel like he contributed pretty well. And as he like eases into the offense and becomes more comfortable, I think that there's more potential, especially with how Geno likes to spread the ball with their tight ends.
And that's something that I hope that we see into next year, obviously, because obviously you've got DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett out wide in terms of your weapons, but tight end, outside of a few guys, obviously you look at a guy like George Kittle had a solid game last night, I believe. Travis Kelce almost tied the playoff record for receptions in a game, let alone by a tight end, right? So you look at those guys, and that's sort of your upper echelon, but a lot of the time you see these tight ends maybe fall back in terms of recognition. It's like, okay, he could just be another blocking tight end. That's what Seattle's been known for a lot of the times, is obviously with the blocking. Jimmy Graham was here, obviously, is several years ago, which is crazy to think about. But I'm intrigued by Noah Fant because of his athletic ability and his youth. So anywhere is a cool visor. So there's that, right? We went with different ends of the season here for our game of the year category. And again, it makes sense, makes a lot of sense. But I just thought I went with the season opener against the Broncos. I thought this was sort of a game that it really set, like I talked about with Geno Smith's story kind of replicating the Seahawks season. I just thought that this was a game that sort of also set the tone for what we're able to see from the Seahawks this year, because going into this game, I was like, okay, it was Monday night, right, in Seattle. Russell Wilson's here. He's supposed to, light us up effectively after the trade, all that sort of stuff. And I remember there was an article that is Seattle better than expected. And they were throughout the course of the season. Even with the game going down to a missed field goal in this one, your game had a missed field goal in it towards the end. And Seattle kind of had to squeak in at the very last second here, just like in that game against the Broncos. So I saw some things there. We just talked about newcomers of the year. Nwosu had, I believe, a couple hits on Russell Wilson. I believe, too, actually, the first touchdown, and it's not a dig on Tariq, but the first touchdown that the Broncos scored, Tariq Woolen got beat, unfortunately. Ken Walker was nowhere to be seen in this game. I'm going through our list here of superlatives. I'm like, hey, all these guys were involved in this game. But I felt like that really set the tone for one of the more memorable Seahawks seasons in the last few years, and a team that, should hopefully springboard into more success as the years go on because of that young talent and the makeup of this team so far. You went with Week 18 versus the Rams, a game that Seattle needed to win in the first place and then get some outside help later in the day in order to make the playoffs. Why was that your selection?
Well, I thought your selection was really great because, like you said, it set the tone for the whole season. And it was a game where you were automatically counted out. So it was great to see the Seahawks win that one. But I went with week 18 just because of, like you said, they needed to win to make the playoffs with some help. But it was just such an important game. And to be able to control what you can in terms of your fate for the playoffs, I think they executed well and did it on a defensive play, which is great. And yeah, it just, for me, it was, this is win or go home, and they showed up.
They didn't do so without being a little frustrating throughout the course of that game, but they were able to get it done ultimately. And that's the thing too. It was a divisional game against the Rams. The Rams didn't have anything to play for, but they're always generally a pain to deal with.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that that game was close, but just because of some of the execution stuff that we talked about after that week, it could have been better. Now we get to sort of the stuff to move forward towards the off season here with the Seahawks and what to address. So you went here with the order of the offensive and defensive line. I went with the defensive line. I need a backup inside linebacker for Jordan Brooks because Cody Barton, with the year that he had and the struggle that he's shown after being sort of in the wings for years to come, doesn't excite me whatsoever to have that next year. And in terms of trying to bulk up your run defense, that guy missed too many tackles. So can't have that, right? Can't have a revolving door as a linebacker. And that interior offensive line is what's important to me. Austin Blythe was serviceable as a center this year. Your guard situation is very interesting because Gabe Jackson was a guy who split time with Phil Haynes. You have a guy like Gabe Jackson who you acquired from Oakland. What was it, last year or a year before that? And is expected to be a starter, and he's splitting time with a guy, which is maybe that's more indicative of the player that Phil Haynes is. But it's a very interesting. You've got Damian Lewis on the other side of things. So I think your tackles are set. I think it's that interior part of it is where I went here with areas to address. What are your thoughts? Obviously, I think defensive line is just generally that's the consensus. We need to get better there. But your thoughts on Seattle's areas that they really need to address this season?
Yeah, I mean, they need to, in addition to helping Gino have more time on offense, obviously helping K9 break loose. So that was my thought process for the offensive line. And then the defensive line, we know how bad our run defense is. So just like you said, we know that's an area that needs to be addressed. And I completely agree with you with Cody Barton. So that kind of tied in with the offensive line because yeah, we definitely need someone that's not going to miss tackles that can be crucial to a game.
And that's something. Whoopsie. That's something that. There we go. That's something that is key, right? You look at this. Cody Barton might just be fine overall, but when you look at contending teams and stuff like that, you can't just have fine. You have to be good or a lot of times better. You look at the guys that step up for these teams that are still playing football. And a lot of them, they have guys step up because of injury. And when I've got a guy like Cody Barton who's considered a starter, and that's who I have to rely on for a lot of it, it's a big issue. You talk about the lines. Feels like the Seahawks have been dealing with line issues, whether it's offensive or defensive, for the entire Pete Carroll era.
Yeah.
So it's obviously something that needs to be addressed both sides. And with the picks here, we're gonna have mock drafts come up. We're gonna have to start doing mock drafts, so that'll be interesting. But with draft season coming up, who knows? Maybe a guy like Jalen Carter falls to us at number 5. Maybe Seattle trades out of the number 5 spot. I know that in those exit interviews, when Pete Carroll was asked about it, he said that I'm not going to answer. I'm not going to give you any hints on what we're doing at number 5. So that'll be really interesting here. And then we'll wrap up with the free agents. Now, free agents, this is the list of unrestricted free agents here. There are a bunch of guys that, a lot of depth here, but picked out some ones that made a lot of sense. We both have Geno Smith, which makes a ton of sense, obviously. Ryan Neal as well, who's a guy, again, we sung the praises of Ryan Neal effectively the last few weeks and the contribution he's been able to make every single year, whether he's a starter or not, has been crucial. You got to keep him around, and it sounds like he wants to be around anyway. So both of those guys that we have unanimously both already sound like they're going to be around for Seattle. You went with Rashad Penny. Now, when healthy, obviously he's a great contributor, but I'm intrigued to see what your case is for him to return as a Seahawk next season.
And like you said, health obviously plays a big part in it, but just having a 1-2 punch, and we've seen what Rashad Penny can contribute. So if he's able to stay healthy, I'm not going to say who I feel should take that RB1 position, but yeah, just being able to have both guys back there, I think would be a huge help to the offense. So was health the only reason why he wasn't included on your list?
Availability is a big deal, man. I can't be paying a guy a certain amount of money to, like you said, I can't really put a depth chart label on anybody at the moment. But a guy who you'd think effectively would be a top 2 back, I doubt he falls lower than 3, right? And pay him, he's gonna want money. He might be okay. I got injured again. I'm not going to take up a large amount of your cap space. He's not going to command like the veteran minimum. That's just not going to happen. So it's something to really look at. I think it's going to be a tough decision. I know that It's been great to see him have struggles for years, have a breakout sort of end of the season. Not this current NFL season, but the last one.
Last season.
And even I think in the first few weeks he was healthy, he didn't do horrible, right? So it's a tough decision, but I think in my opinion, I don't know if he returns to Seattle, and I would lean on the side of no. I went with a few other guys here, but Poona Ford, I'd like to see Poona back. It was interesting to hear in the exit interviews that Pete Carroll said that they had to play him outside of his position effectively. I believe it was in like a 3 technique outside of where he normally lines up as a nose tackle right over the center. So they like to get back to him doing that next year. When they say we'd like to get him to do that, something like that, sounds like they want him back, right?
Yeah.
So unless Poona decides to say, I'm out of here and ship off, I doubt that's much of an issue. Phil Haynes is interesting because, again, I talked about Phil Haynes being a guy that split time with Gabe Jackson at the offensive guard spot. He's younger than Gabe Jackson, and if he's splitting time with a guy like that, why don't we just give him that overall, cut our losses with Gabe Jackson, take his cap off the books, and you've got Phil Haynes there, who's a younger guy, a younger option, is already basically a starter anyway, a half starter, right? And to get him full time. Marquise Goodwin's one I'm a little more interested to see how that goes. I know that there have been some mock drafts that predict Seattle will take a wide receiver with one of their 4 picks in the first 2 rounds of this draft. Someone threw a Jordan Addison's name around out of USC. I don't know if they get him, but it sounds like that's something that Seattle will add through the draft. So you might take him off there, or maybe you sign him and he's a 4th wide receiver, but I would like to see him back. Before he really got injured, I thought he was a guy that was able to contribute. When DK Metcalf went down against the Chargers, I believe Marquise had 2 touchdowns in that game. So a veteran wide receiver who's got some speed and was able to contribute, I don't think he's going to command too much money. I don't, see why you wouldn't bring him in. That's where my thinking was with that. Do you have any comments on guys like Goodwin, Poona, or Phil?
No, I thought they had a good contribution. Like, I understand why you put them on the list. Yeah, I just, with a possible wide receiver coming in, I understand wanting to keep a veteran, but we also have Metcalf and Lockett who are considered veterans, so maybe they do want to try to spice things up by bringing someone new in. Yeah, that's my only comment there. So we'll move on to some league news here. On the 19th, Aaron Donald confirmed that he is playing next season amid retirement rumors. So we still got to deal with Donald in the league. Not that he has anything to prove anymore, but he wants to stay. On the 20th, Purdy is likely SF's QB1 in 2023. Unless Trey Lance makes a seismic jump, Brock Purdy will be 49ers starting QB next season. That's crazy because he just beat out Trey Lance and Jimmy Garoppolo, who had kind of a weird contract in the air anyway, but still, that's pretty commanding by Purdy.
Yeah, it's funny to see how that'll go for San Francisco. Jimmy Garoppolo is probably gone. I think that's like a given. But with Trey Lance, what a way for them to trade up for that pick, and just now you got a guy like Brock Purdy squaring off.